Hi, everyone. This is Mrs. Olson, and I'm here today to talk to you about evidence for evolution. You've been studying evolution now for a few days, and you've learned about natural selection and how species change over time. And I'm hoping you're asking the question right now, what evidence do we have for evolution? I'm going to show you three different types of evidence for evolution today. There are more than three types, but biologists often look to and talk about these three types of evidence as the main evidence for evolution. Scientists use many types of empirical data to determine how species have changed over time, and empirical data means observable data. The three types that we're going to talk about today are anatomical, fossil, and molecular. The first one's anatomical evidence, and just like it sounds, it has to do with the anatomy of an organism or organisms. Anatomical evidence is evidence of internal anatomy of the body structures of organisms that are similar. So they compare the body structures of organisms to look at if they have a common ancestor and how recent their common ancestor is. They also might look at the function of the body structure. So not just what is the structure and how is it similar in shape and in position, but how is it used by the organism. And a term that relates to this is homologous structures. I'm going to say it again, that's homologous structures. It has this prefix homo that we learned in genetics that means the same. So homologous structures are structural features in organisms that are similar in arrangement, function, or both. So if you would look at these two skulls right here, you'll see that the homologous structures, some of them are colored. And so this yellow bone at the end of the jaw and this yellow bone at the end of the jaw are similar in structure and definitely similar in arrangement where they exist in the skull. And also the green one is the green are, homologous to one another, and the purple is homologous to the other purple. And so those are structures in an organism that are similar. The second type of evidence is fossil evidence. And we're going to start by talking about relative dating related to fossil evidence. The dating of rock layers in the earth is relative dating. If the earth has been undisturbed, then we would predict that the oldest layers of the earth are at the bottom and the youngest are at the top. And so if you look at this image, this looks like it could be taken in Wisconsin Dells. This is sandstone here, and we would predict that the bottom layers are oldest and the top layers are the youngest. And so this is relative dating. So we don't necessarily know the time because the sandstones probably can't be radio dated. However, we can say it's relative. We know that this layer in this image is older than this layer. So it's relative dating. And if you find fossils of once living organisms within the rock layer, then you can estimate its age and which are younger and which are older. So the fossils are found in the rock, and the rock is then used to date the fossils. And so fossil evidence is evidence of a species that no longer may exist, and the fossils fill in the record of ancestors of species alive today. So if I go back to this slide, you can see that there's this fossil right here and this fossil right here. So we can assume that this fossil is younger than that one. And if we track the fossils throughout the rock layer and we look at the changes often in the structural features, then we can determine what are some gaps in between, what the organisms may have looked at in between the time of the fossils that we have. If fossils are interesting to you, you're really going to want to take geology as a class here at Baraboo High School. It's a super cool class, and you'll learn more about fossils. The next type of empirical evidence for evolution is molecular evidence. This is probably the most powerful and also the one that you know the most about because it's all about DNA, RNA, amino acids, and proteins of an organism. And we spent a whole bunch of time this semester talking about DNA, RNA, amino acids, and proteins in organisms. The DNA, RNA, and protein sequences are compared between organisms. This is our newest form of evidence because of our genetic technology and also probably our strongest. the more closely related organisms have the most similar sequences. So if you look at this top row right here of evidence, what these letters represent are proteins within an organism. So we have goose, swan, ostrich, chicken, mouse, and phage. Phage is a virus. And the yellow highlighted parts are the only proteins that are different. So in this sequence of proteins in these organisms, you can see that there aren't many differences, even between a goose and a mouse, for example. And if the proteins are very similar, then you should be able to work your way back and know that the amino acids that make up the proteins are the same, mRNA code is the same, and the DNA itself is very similar. And so if DNA is similar among organisms, that's some pretty strong evidence for a common ancestor. I'm going to give you one more example, one way to apply this before you're done listening to me today. And so right here we have the forearm, so your arm of a human, and over here we have the forelimb, kind of like the foreflipper of a whale. And you can see here that there are some homologous structures. And so my question to you is, what evidence do we have in this image that supports the idea that all organisms come from a common ancestor? So how could we look at these two forelimbs of completely different species? One lives on land and one lives in the water. One uses its forelimb, us, for a very different task than the forelimb of a whale. We use our forelimbs to manipulate objects, to pick them up, to write, to draw, to move stuff. And a whale simply uses its forelimbs just to propel itself through the water. So these are totally different functions, but similar structures, homologous structures. So take a look at these images, and how could you explain to someone else that the two forelimbs in this image is evidence that the whale and the human probably have a common ancestor way back in time? If you look at how I have labeled the forelimbs, we can talk real specifically about the evidence. So I'm going to start with the phalanges, which in us are the fingers. If you look, I've numbered them. It's hard to see once I move it, but 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, there are fingers. And if you look at the whale, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 phalanges. This is really interesting because if you just looked at a flipper of a whale, you wouldn't predict necessarily that it has fingers underneath that thick layer of blubber and skin, but it does. And so it's really important to notice that this isn't just one hard bone. It's 5 separate fingers. So that's some pretty strong evidence that these had a common ancestor, that at one time all 5 of the finger structures were very similar, and then over time they have evolved, and through slow adaptations, slow mutations, that the finger structures have gotten a little bit different, but the main structure of 5 different finger structures is still there. And then also, if you look at the forearm of the human right here, you can see I labeled the bones in the forearm B and C. There's a B and C still here. They're also easily identified because they're striped or they're not colored in. And then the humerus right here on a human, A bone, is still, you can still find that same bone structure within the whale. So I could say that bones A in both image drawings of the whale and the human are homologous, and that would be evidence for a common ancestor. Make sure you ask your teacher if you have questions about empirical evidence for evolution, and have a fantastic rest of your day.